photograph is wet, not damaged by water in the modern sense, not warped by a flood, but developed on a rainy afternoon in a badly ventilated room, so that the emulsion never fully settled and the whole surface carries a faint sheen, like glass breathed on and wiped too quickly. It is a group portrait. Ward photographs of this kind were common in the first decade of the 20th century, an administrative habit more than an act of memory, a way for institutions to prove their patients existed and were fed. 11 men stand in 2 loose rows before a brick wall, and above them, painted directly onto that brick in tall serif letters, are the words that fix the moment in time and place: a county asylum, a ward number, and the year 1907. 10 of the men are ordinary. I want you to understand that first, because it is the ordinariness that makes the 11th unbearable. They are thin, most of them, in the way institutional men were thin, cheeks drawn, collars too large, hands hanging heavy and useless at their sides. Some look at the camera, some look at the floor. One has closed his eyes against the magnesium flash. They are men who have been arranged, told where to stand, told to be still for the long exposure, and they have obeyed with the exhausted patience of people who no longer own their own days. And then there is the figure at the back. He stands a full head above every other man in the frame, not a little taller, not the difference of a big man among small ones. A full head, the crown of the tallest ordinary patient, reaches only to the base of his throat. His shoulders begin where their faces end. To place him in that row, the photographer would have had to tilt the whole plate, and you can see that he tried. The top of the frame crowds close against the figure's hair, as though the camera itself could not contain him and gave up the attempt. He wears the same grey ward clothing as the others, but on him it has failed. The sleeves end well above the wrist, exposing forearms that are too long for the arm, wrists that are too wide for the hand. The trousers stop short of the ankle. His body has outgrown everything that was issued to cover it, and no one, it seems, could find anything larger. But height alone is not what stops the breath, it is the stillness. Every other man in that photograph carries the small betrayals of a living body forced to hold a pose, a blurred hand, a shifted foot, the softening of an outline where someone swayed during the long seconds the lens stayed open. The tall figure has none of that. He is perfectly, absolutely sharp, sharper than a man standing that long should be able to be. In an exposure that lasted whole seconds, he did not move at all, not a breath's worth, not a heartbeat's tremor. And so while the others dissolve slightly at their edges into the grey, he alone is rendered with a terrible clarity, as if he were the only solid thing in the room, and the rest were smoke, and his face is turned, not away, not toward, turned just enough. The other men present themselves flat to the camera or drop their gaze. He has rotated his head some 15 or 20 degrees so that we see him in a 3/4 angle that catches the long jaw, the deep hollow beneath the cheekbone, the heavy ridge of brow. It is the angle at which a face stops being a portrait and becomes something observed, as though at the moment the shutter opened he was not being photographed, but was watching the photographer, and the watching is what the plate caught. The features are not monstrous. That is the wrong word, and I have thought carefully about the right one. They are elongated. Everything human is present but stretched, drawn out along a vertical axis, the way a reflection lengthens in a slow-moving river. The nose too long, the chin too far below the mouth, the distance between the eyes and the hairline too great, each part correct on its own, the sum of them wrong. I first saw this photograph 3 years ago in a bound county volume that had been catalogued, mislabelled and forgotten. I have since sat with it longer than I have sat with any single image in my life. I have shown it to people without explanation and watched their eyes go, every time, without fail, to the same place, past the 10 ordinary men, straight to the back of the room, to him. The eye knows before the mind does. Something in us is built to measure the men around us against ourselves, to read height and reach and threat in an instant, older than language, and that ancient part of the mind looks at this figure and quietly refuses. He is outside the range. He is above the ceiling of what the body is permitted to do. There is a number written on the lower margin in brown ink, a patient reference, and beside it 2 words in a clerk's tired hand, not a name. The institution did not record a name for him, or recorded one and then thought better of it. The 2 words are these: the tall. That is all. The tall, as if the rest of the description had been abandoned because no one could agree how to finish it. As if height were not a measurement of him, but the whole of him, the single fact that swallowed every other fact, the thing you noticed and then could notice nothing else past. I want to tell you what he was, not what a frightened orderly thought he was, not what the village 3 miles down the valley whispered he was, what the records, when you gather them, when you lay the parish pages beside the medical ledgers, beside the doorframes that still stand, what all of it, taken together, says he was. Because the truth I found is stranger than illness and quieter than legend, and it does not stay safely in 1907. It reaches forward. It is, I have come to believe, still reaching. He was not a sick man who happened to be tall. He was the last living heir of a bloodline whose men never stopped growing, a family whose sons died standing 7 feet and more, whose bones lengthened past every ceiling the human frame is supposed to obey, and whose height was not an affliction but an inheritance, a mark passed down like a name, the one thing that could not be hidden and the one thing that gave him away. He was the final vessel of a line that bred, generation after generation, toward the sky. And the day that photograph was taken, someone had finally found him. To find him, you have to go back before the ward, before the camera, before the number in brown ink. You have to go to a parish register in a small stone church whose roof has since been replaced twice, in a valley I will not name here for reasons that will become clear, and you have to find the entry for a foundling brought in during the cold months at the very end of the previous century. The hand that wrote it was careful, a curate's hand, trained to record baptisms and burials in even lines. But this entry breaks the line. There is no mother's name. There is no father's name. There is a date, approximate, and a place, left at the door of the almshouse, wrapped in sacking, not crying. And then, where the child's given name should be, there is a hesitation you can see across 120 years, the ink pools. The pen was lifted, and then, instead of a name, the curate wrote a description, an unusually large male infant. Unusually large. For a newborn, that phrase means one thing, and it is not what he meant. Because the same register, 3 years later, notes the same child again. The parish paid for children's shoes, and there is a line item, and beside the payment someone has added a marginal note that the shoes did not fit, that no shoes fit, that the boy had outgrown the almshouse allowance before his 4th winter. By 7 he appears in a schoolmaster's attendance book, and the schoolmaster, who was not a doctor and had no reason to lie, wrote that the boy stood level with the lintel of the schoolroom door. Level with the lintel. At 7 years old, they stopped calling him by any name almost at once. In every document that survives, he is the tall boy, the tall child, the great lad from the almshouse, as if the parish had made the same decision the asylum would make 30 years later, that the height was the whole of him, and the rest was not worth the ink. And here is the first thing that unsettled me, sitting in the county archive with these pages spread under a reading lamp. It was not that he was tall. Tall children exist. It was that no one recorded him getting older. They recorded him getting taller. Age was measured, in his case, in inches of the doorframe. The medical record begins when he is 9. A physician. I have his name. I have his membership number in the Provincial Medical Society, and I have chosen to withhold it because his descendants are living and have asked me to, was called to the almshouse because the boy's legs had begun to ache in a way that would not stop. Growing pains, the matron said. The physician wrote otherwise. He wrote that the pain was not in the muscle but in the bone, at the growth plates, at the very ends of the long bones where a child's height is manufactured, and that those plates, which in every other human being narrow and close and fall silent by the early 20s, were in this boy roaring. He measured the boy's height. He measured it again 4 months later. The difference he recorded is a number that, if you know anything about human growth, you will read twice and then set the paper down. It is not the growth of a child. It is the growth of something that has not been told to stop. He kept measuring. That is what saves this from being legend, a physician who did the dull, patient, unglamorous thing and wrote a number in a ledger every few months for years. Height, wingspan, the length of the femur, estimated by palpation, and later, when the boy could be brought to a hospital, by the new photographic plates that could look through flesh at the bone beneath. And in the margins of those measurements, the physician's notes change character. They stop sounding like medicine. Early on, he writes of a case, a condition, a patient. Later, he writes of a phenomenon. And once, only once, in a hand that is noticeably less steady than the rest, he writes a question rather than an observation. Where does this end? It did not end. The joints ached because they were being asked to do impossible work, to bear a frame that lengthened faster than the cartilage could reinforce it, and the boy, young man now, began to stoop, not from age, but from architecture, the spine curving under a body that kept adding stories to itself. The physician noted the spine could not stop reaching. That is his phrase, and I have quoted it exactly. Not the boy could not stop growing. The spine could not stop reaching, as if the bone itself had an intention, a direction, a hunger that pointed upward and would not be reasoned with. And it was around this time, when the measurements had passed every ceiling the medical texts of the day allowed, that the whispers reached the physician's ears, because the valley remembered something the almshouse ledgers did not. 3 miles down the road, at the head of the valley where the good land gave out, there had been a family. The old people still gave them a name, though they lowered their voices to do it, and I have that name in 3 separate sources and will not print it. What the old people agreed on, across witnesses who never met each other, was this: the men of that family were giants, not in the storybook sense, in the specific, terrible, domestic sense of men who could not stand upright in their own house, who slept diagonally, who died young, always young, and who died standing, because by the end they could no longer lie flat without pain. The sons all reached 7 feet. Some, the oldest people insisted, reached far past it, and then, within a single generation, the family was simply gone. No graves you could point to, no last will, a cottage that fell in on itself, a line that stopped, or seemed to stop, seemed to. Because a family does not always end when its house does. Sometimes it ends with an infant left in sacking at an almshouse door, wrapped and carried in the dark by someone who knew exactly what that child would become and could not bear to watch it happen again under their own roof. Someone who left no name because a name was the one thing that could connect the tall boy to the vanished giants, and connect the giants to whatever it was that made them. That is the moment the whole thing turned over in my hands. He was not sick, or rather, the sickness the doctors kept reaching for, a gland, a tumour, a tragic accident of one body, could not explain a family, a lineage, a pattern of men bred across generations toward the same impossible height, dying in the same impossible posture, upright, reaching. What the physician was measuring in that almshouse was not a disease. It was an inheritance running its full length in a single living body. The others had died before the line could be understood. This one, the foundling, the tall boy, the great lad, was the last of them, and he had been found, at last, by people with rulers and cameras and case numbers, people who would measure the inheritance to its final inch, and the closer they came to measuring it, the more determined someone became that it should never be measured at all. The ward records for the winter of 1907 into the spring of 1908 do not so much end as thin. I want to be precise about what I mean because it is easy to say the archive was destroyed and reach for a locked room and a burning candle. That is not what happened. What happened is quieter and worse. The measurements simply stop being taken in the way they had been taken. For 3 years, the tall boy had been logged with the obsessive regularity of a man kept as an exhibit. Height on admission, height at 6 months, height at 12. The length of the femur estimated from an X-ray plate the county could barely afford, the span of the outstretched arms, the circumference of the skull. Page after page in the same clerk's hand, growing not in penmanship but in reluctance, the figures getting larger and the annotations getting shorter until the notes read only "measured again," and then, at last, do not read anything at all. There is a single line in the resident physician's daybook, dated the 4th of March, that I have gone back to more times than I can defend. It begins in ink, "Subject now stands," and then stops. The sentence is never finished. The number that should follow it is not there, not crossed out, not smudged. Absent, as though the hand holding the pen had been touched on the wrist and told, gently, that some heights are better left unwritten. Beneath it, in a different ink and a different pressure, someone has added 4 words that were never meant to be a confession and have become one. No purpose in continuing. No purpose in continuing. I have read that phrase as surrender and as instruction. I cannot decide which frightens me more. What followed was not silence exactly. It was the slow, administrative unmaking of a person. The ward that had held him was cleared that April for what the board minutes describe as reallocation to fever cases, a reasonable enough thing, except that the fever never seems to have come and the beds stood empty for the better part of a year afterward, according to the very same minutes. The staff who had signed his measurement sheets, 3 named nurses and 1 orderly whose signature I can still make out, appear in the following year's employment ledger under other wards, other duties, and in 2 cases under other institutions in other counties entirely. People do move, nurses transfer, but they transferred all at once, in the same season, away from the same room. And when a local historian in the 1960s wrote to the last of them, an elderly woman then living near Shrewsbury, she wrote back a single line denying she had ever worked in that ward at all. Her name is on 4 of the sheets in a hand that matches her letter. She had measured him with her own hands, and, 60 years on, she needed it not to be true. That is the thing about a recantation. It is not always a lie told to deceive you. Sometimes it is a lie a person tells to survive their own memory, and so the trail runs down to almost nothing, to the one piece of evidence that could not be transferred, could not be reassigned, could not sign a letter denying itself. A doorframe. The interior door of that emptied ward, still standing when a building surveyor photographed the derelict wing in 1934 before its demolition, and standing in that photograph is a doorframe scored with a ladder of horizontal marks cut into the wood with a knife. Growth marks, the kind any parent has cut for a child against a kitchen wall, except these climb past the lintel. They climb onto the transom above the door, where no head should ever reach, the last of them scored so high that the man who made it must have stood on something, or must not have needed to. The surveyor, who had no idea what he was looking at, noted only unusual vandalism to door surround, possibly patience. That photograph, Plate 11 in the demolition survey, is very nearly all we have left of the height that no one was permitted to write down. The wood is gone. The marks survive only as silver on paper. Now I owe you the other explanation, the sane one, because it is strong and I will not hide from it. Every physician I have shown this file to says the same word before I have finished speaking, and the word is acromegaly. A tumour on the pituitary, a gland flooding a body with growth hormone long after the body should have stopped, lengthening the jaw, thickening the hands, aching the joints, forcing the frame upward year after painful year. It fits the ache in his shoulders. It fits the spine that could not lie flat. It fits the early deaths because acromegalic hearts fail young. It even fits, if you push it, the family, for these conditions can be genetic, can run in bloodlines, can appear as the syndrome the textbooks now call familial isolated pituitary adenoma, a real inherited tendency toward exactly this kind of towering, suffering giant. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it persuasive because a narrator who cannot be moved by the truth is of no use to you. A frightened village, a genuinely ill man, a gland, a myth grown up around a medical tragedy that explains almost everything in this story. Almost. It explains the boy. It does not explain the doorframe that kept being marked, because the ward was demolished in 1934 and the marks should have ended there, with the wood, with the century. They did not. In 1971, a warden at a hostel built on part of that same ground reported to the district council that the interior of a store cupboard had been defaced with knife-cut lines climbing the frame, the highest well above the door, and he swore no resident tall enough had ever been housed there. In 1994, a contractor renovating a nearby property found the same ladder of scars inside a boxed-in chimney breast, fresh cuts in old wood, the topmost mark higher than the last. And there is one from 2008, photographed on a phone in the frame of a fire door in a building that did not exist when the tall boy drew breath, the marks rising past a man's reach, each cut, when you line the photographs up decade by decade, standing higher than the one before, higher each decade, as if the thing being measured is still growing, as if the line did not end in that emptied ward at all, but only went unwritten, unnamed, uncarried in the dark to some other door, and is still, quietly, patiently, measuring itself against the world, waiting for the frame it can finally stand up straight beneath. So I come back to where I began, to the rain on the glass of a 1907 photograph and the figure a full head above the rest, his face turned just enough to be wrong. I thought, when I started, that I was tracing the last of something, a bloodline that bred toward the sky and ran out, as bloodlines do. I am no longer sure the word last belongs in this story at all. The doctors measured him until they were told to stop. The witnesses unremembered him until they believed it. The wood was carried off and burned. And still, somewhere, in a doorframe that is newer than all of it, a fresh cut appears, higher than the last, made by someone no ruler has ever caught and no camera has ever quite faced. If the bloodline truly died with him, tell me who keeps marking the doors. I have spent, all told, the better part of 2 years inside this material, and I want to tell you plainly what that does to a person. You begin by looking for a man. You end by looking for a measurement. You stop asking who he was and start asking how tall, and the moment you ask how tall, you notice that the question has no ceiling and that no answer you find ever holds still. Let me lay the doorframes out one more time, because this is the part I cannot make quiet. The 1907 photograph gives us the ward at Hollowmere, and against the plaster behind the tall boy there is a vertical smudge that I once dismissed as damp, until I found, in the 1911 discharge inventory, a line item ordering the cupboard door in the west corridor to be replaced on account of damage to the frame. Damage to the frame, not the wall, not the lock. The frame, the very thing you would scar if you were standing a boy against it and drawing a line above his head again and again, watching the line climb. The doctors did that. It was their instinct, their training to measure, and when they were told to stop measuring on paper, some hand kept measuring on wood. Then the paper stops entirely. The ledger breaks off mid-column, as I showed you, the last recorded figure struck through and the pages after it clean. But the wood does not stop. That is the thing that will not let me sleep. The 1953 cupboard in the demolished East Wing. The 1971 council complaint about the defaced store cupboard, the highest cut, well above the door. The 1994 chimney breast, fresh knife work in old timber. The 2008 fire door, photographed on a phone by a man who did not know he was standing inside a 200-year-old riddle. 4 door frames, 4 decades. And when I aligned the photographs to a common scale, the standard height of a door hinge, which changes very little across a century of British joinery, the topmost mark on each one stands higher than the topmost mark before it. I want to be honest about how much I resisted that. I told myself it was coincidence, that tall men exist, that anyone can carve a line in a doorframe as a joke or a memory of a child's growth. Parents mark their children's heights on kitchen walls. It is the most ordinary act of love there is. But children stop. A child reaches 5 feet, 5.5, 6 if you are fortunate, and then the marks bunch together at the top of the frame and stop because the body has finished. These marks do not bunch, they do not slow. They climb past the height of the door itself, past the reach of a standing man, into the dead space above the lintel where no one carves anything, because there is nothing there to measure against. And still they climb. And here, at the very end, I have to give the skeptic his full due, because he has walked patiently beside me this whole way, and he deserves to speak last before the silence. His name, in my head, is every careful doctor who ever wrote constitutional gigantism in a margin and moved on. He says, "This is acromegaly, a tumour of the pituitary gland, a flood of growth hormone into a body that cannot refuse it, bones that lengthen and thicken and ache exactly as the parish doctors recorded, a jaw that grows heavy, a brow that grows deep, a spine that curves under its own reaching." He says the tall boy was a sick child, not an inheriting one, and that a frightened village with a memory of some earlier tall family simply braided the two together into a bloodline that never existed. He says the vanished sons who died standing 7 feet or more are folklore, the way every district has its giant, its drowned bell, its lane no one walks after dark. And he says the doorframes are the cruelest kind of ordinary, carved by different hands across a century, tall people and tricksters and grieving parents, and that I, hungry for a pattern, lined them up and made a bloodline out of coincidence and old wood. I find this persuasive. I need you to hear that I find it persuasive, because a story like this is only worth telling if the man telling it has looked the plain explanation in the face. Acromegaly is real. It explains the aching joints, the lengthening bones, the doctor's astonishment, the early deaths. It explains why every man in that line stood too tall and died young and stooped. It explains almost everything. Almost, because acromegaly is not inherited down a single male line for 200 years, sons dying at the same terrible height as their fathers, generation after generation, as though the body were reading from a plan. Acromegaly does not erase a man's measurements mid-ledger. It does not persuade 3 separate witnesses to unremember a face until they weep with the effort. And a tumour of the gland, whatever else it does not reach out of an emptied Edwardian ward across the demolition of the very building that held it and carve a fresh line higher than the last into the frame of a fire door in a structure that was poured from concrete 100 years after the boy was born. The sickness ends with the body. The marks do not end. That is the seam the skeptic cannot stitch shut, and I have watched him try. So I come back, one final time, to the rain on the glass. To the 1907 plate, the ward at Hollowmere, the row of pale faces turned to the camera, and the one figure, a full head above them all, too tall, too still, his face turned just enough to be wrong, as though even then, even caught in silver, he would not let himself be fully measured. I used to think I was looking at an ending, the last of a bloodline that grew toward the sky and finally, mercifully, ran out. I have stood in front of that photograph for 2 years now, and I no longer believe the word last was ever true. They measured him until they were forbidden. They forgot him until they believed the forgetting. They carried the marked wood out into the yard and burned it to ash. Every door was replaced, every ledger closed, every witness quieted, every proof undone, and still the doors keep being marked. Still, somewhere newer than all of it, a fresh cut appears in fresh timber, higher than the last, made by a hand no ruler has ever caught and no camera has ever quite faced, patient, unhurried, measuring itself against a world that keeps building doors it is not yet tall enough to stand beneath. If the bloodline truly died with him, then tell me quietly before you close this and go back to your evening. Who is still marking the doors, and why do they keep marking them higher?